When Mark, firstly, I'm very pleased to be here and have the chance to sort of take part in this discussion. When Mark actually asked me if I would take part, he said he thought I was going to present a somewhat contrarian view, which I was a little bit puzzled by, but he was referring to things he'd heard from me earlier in a project we're working on. So let me first say that in the basic thrust of the argument here, I fully agree with. I don't know of anybody who's worked in this area who could not agree with the importance of agriculture in relation to climate change, and especially climate change development in agriculture. It's clear we're faced with a massive challenge. Sometimes I get a bit depressed by the scale of the challenge, but I do hear from those people far more expert in the field than I am that we do have a lot of resources, a lot of tools, a lot of ideas to throw at that challenge, and therefore they're still confident that we can win in that challenge, and that keeps me going in this area. What I want to talk about here mostly is the relationship with the climate negotiations, and in particular Copenhagen, but I want to look beyond Copenhagen as well. It's been suggested several times that we should be bringing this and putting this in front of the negotiators leading up to Copenhagen and in Copenhagen. Again, I agree. The more we keep on repeating this message of the importance of actually taking very proactive action in the agricultural area, the better. There's no question about that. But I do have to ask, what do we mean by getting this into the Copenhagen negotiations? Firstly, if it is to raise the profile of agriculture in the overall outcome of Copenhagen, yes. That could be done, in fact, through essentially what I call the adaptation agenda. That is that it is clear that Copenhagen will include as part of the package greatly increased resources to help developing countries adapt. I think developed countries are going to realise as well that they have to put more resources into their own adaptation. And I think we are going to see huge improvements in what's in that whole area in the next few years. But Copenhagen at the moment is acting as something of a bottleneck, and even though the outcomes in Copenhagen is not going to seal everything and do every deal, I think we'll see the attitudes change after Copenhagen on some of these issues. What that might mean, centres of excellence is being talked about in the negotiations, that is, as part of the adaptation package. There should be a series of centres of excellence scattered across the developing countries. I think that there's a lot of strength in that. But I think one of the core questions, of course, is what is the role of the CGR system in relation to those centres of excellence? I won't touch upon CGR and the climate change negotiations. I've spent, I think, 2 weeks in Nairobi at various times discussing that issue, and I'm not certain where we stand on that situation at the moment. But I think one thing is clear, and this comes up again even when we're discussing with some of the energy people in the bank. They keep on pointing to the CGR system as the model for actually delivering applicable research results in developing countries. So I think we have to look carefully at the role there. But the other point, of course, is can we include agriculture in the mitigation agenda? And again, I would argue very strongly we must be striving to do that. But, and this is where Mark maybe thought there was going to be a contrarian view, and there is. I will put up some of the pitfalls here. And let me say, I can claim to be one of the strongest advocates of including land-based emissions and uptakes in the climate change agreements. I was a co-editor of the special report on LULUCF by IPCC. We went through these battles many, many years ago over lots of different issues. Let me just, the whole issue of LULUCF, those land-based emissions and uptakes, has always been contentious. Why? It varies. I've got to find my right card here. Basically, back at soon after Kyoto, there's a very strong, I'll say, antagonism towards the CDM itself. It came largely, but not only, from European NGOs and green groups, but there was support from here in the US and elsewhere as well, who basically felt the CDM was a let-off for the developed countries. They should be actually achieving emission reductions at home, Given that the CDM was strongly supported by many developing countries who saw the possibility of technology and cash transfers, it was difficult to oppose the CDM, so a lot of the focus went onto the LULUCF, where there were real problems that had to be looked at. The methodologies for CDM were always regarded as being doubtful and ill-formed. Since those first talks and the first attitudes were formed, there has been a whole process within the IPCC. I see some of the colleagues here who took part in that, to set up methodologies. And these methodologies have been agreed, and I think most people working in the field accept that they can be improved, but they form the basis of an accounting system. It's not the Rolls-Royce of accounting, but it's the Volkswagen. And what do we need to get from point A to point B? We don't need a Rolls-Royce. A Volkswagen will get us there. The other complaint about the LULUCF was they felt that they were so easy to do that they'd flood the markets. I think anyone who's worked in this particular area on the ground trying to get projects in place and so on realised that was actually rather naive. There were two other problems which I'll come back to later. If we're going to bring agriculture into the current negotiations, I think we have to look at the history of the RED issue. This reduced emissions from avoided deforestation and forest degradation. For me, the main revival of the RED issue, after sort of working with the LULUCF report, was almost 5 years ago when Kevin Conrad came to my office in the bank when I was working in the Biocarbon Fund, and with a great project he had for New Guinea. The idea was basically to get payments for avoided deforestation. Now, I pointed out to him why it wouldn't work, leakage, all sorts of other issues, and he said, well, what can I do? One thing led to another, and the outcome of that is the Coalition for Rainforests and the RED being on the agenda within the current negotiations. But that took 4 years, and it's still not resolved even at this stage. So I think to bring agriculture onto the agenda is going to be very, very tough. Although RED has actually pioneered the way, and I think it can be piggybacked on that, but I would not expect too many clear decisions, certainly in a Copenhagen timeframe. The best I think we can aim for is that there is a clear recognition of the enormous potential for agricultural mitigation, and that be left as an open issue for further discussion as the talks move forward. It comes back to a series of problems again. Is the methodology in the agriculture sector sufficient? Personally, I think it is, but it's going to be queried. Should emissions reductions from agriculture be fully fungible, part of the Kyoto process? Should it be part of a parallel process? I think there are questions that are still open. Should it be trialled first under a voluntary system? And maybe there are certain other countries coming back into the process in a different way who might have other ideas in this area as well, and we can see what happens there. To me, I think there's enormous opportunity to fund this package under essentially the adaptation agenda and trying here to recognise the importance of mitigation as well and packaging in that way as a starting point at least, which then might lead on to more direct inclusion. My final point, and I just want to warn people that this could arise again because it's one of the critical discussions during the special report on LULUCF. And that is, there were two issues. One, well, let me just put this slide up. This shows emissions and uptakes across the globe. And the important point here, the one I want to refer to, is, it's a good place to do it, is this land element here. So this shows essentially what has remained in the atmosphere, what has been taken up in the land, and what is taken up in the ocean. And the point I want to make here is look at the variability in the land uptake. Basically, the land systems take up about, let's just say, 2 gigatons of carbon per year, plus or minus about 2 gigatons of carbon per year. Now, why should that matter? If we start to implement an accounting system which has forestry in it, it has agriculture in it, we're actually coming closer and closer to what some people used to call the wall-to-wall accounting system. In other words, we're incorporating all of our land emissions and uptakes. I think that's a goal that we should be moving towards because we have to monitor everything we're doing. However, how do you put a compliance system in place when you have a variability which swamps the actual size of the compliance measure itself. So it is going to be a challenge. Now, there are ways around this. I think that most people accept that if agriculture was to come into any compliance system, we're not going to be measuring direct methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide emissions. We're going to be recognising activities. So our system itself will smooth out some of these problems, but we must be aware that we are moving closer to this issue, and I think we have to start thinking about it and be prepared to answer that question as the negotiations go forward. The final point, which I hope doesn't come back onto the agenda, but in fact some of that uptake in the land, and obviously in the ocean as well, comes about, of course, because there was already increased CO2. And one of the big horror stories we heard about back during the time of the LULUCF special report was the so-called free ride. That certain countries, because of their forest cover or their vegetation cover, were actually getting enhanced uptake because of the existing CO2 fertilisation, because of existing temperature rise in some countries, and therefore we're getting a benefit that others were not getting. Personally, I think this was actually a completely fallacious, well, not fallacious, it's correct, but a completely irrelevant argument because this can always be taken into account in targets, etc., but it is one that might come back again. So they're my comments on where we stand. I think we have a challenge to get this back into the negotiations. I think it's a challenge we must win. I think it's going to take longer than Copenhagen, but this is the time to start. Thank you.